In this tutorial, we're going to create this scrolling background effect using a vertex shader. If you want to get the same starting project as me, along with all the assets, take a look at the link in the description. Let's begin. So first of all, let's take a look at this example project I prepared. It's very simple. We have a 2D platformer character that can run and jump, and there's a tile map for us to stand on. That's it. Now we're going to create the background that's going to scroll. First of all, we're going to create a sprite 2D node. This is going to be the background. We're going to rename it to be background, and I'm going to place it behind the player and the tile map, just like that. And then we're going to give it a texture. So if you take a look at the file system, we have an assets folder. There's a folder called background. And inside of that, we have a bunch of different background images. The one I'm going to use is going to be the brown.png. So let's take that and drag it into the texture. This is what it looks like. You can see that it's a little bit too small, but don't worry, because we're going to tile this to cover the whole screen. And you can see that it's an image that's going to tile very nicely. So first of all, even though we're going to use a shader to create the effect, I'm going to teach you how to do this without using a custom shader, because it's entirely possible to achieve the same effect using the region settings underneath the sprite 2D here. So let's click on region, click on enabled. Once you do that, the sprite is going to disappear, because we need to give it a width and a height. I'm going to give it a width of 1200 and a height of 750. Then I'm going to place it so that it covers the whole screen, the whole window size. Currently, you can see that it's not being tiled. It's simply being stretched until the end of the width and the height here. In order to make it tile, we need to go into the texture settings, and we need to click on repeat and set it to be enabled. As you can see now, it is being tiled both horizontally and vertically. Good, so that's the first step of this effect, tiling the image. We can play the game and see what that looks like. As you can see, it looks like this. Next step is going to be scrolling it, and we can do that by using these X and Y properties underneath region. I'm going to hold down left click on one of them and scroll my mouse. And as I do that, you will see that the image is scrolling horizontally in this case. And I can do the same thing with the Y to scroll the image vertically. What we can do is we can animate this X and Y with an animation player to create the scrolling effect. And that would be creating this effect without using a custom shader. But like I said, we are going to use a custom shader. So let's go ahead and reset all of this, turn off the region. And now we're going to create our shader. The shader is going to be better because it's going to give us more control over what this looks like. We can tile it in a much different way. We can give it a fragment shader to give it different colors. We can do all sorts of things. That's why that's why using a shader is the better option. And underneath the hood, Godot is using a shader to do the region effect anyways. So if you don't know how to write your own shader, you're stuck with whatever default functionality Godot has. But if you do know how to write shaders, then you can do something entirely custom, which is why shaders are awesome. So let's go into the material tab here inside of the sprite 2D for the background. We're going to create a new shader material, click on it, scroll down. We're going to create a new shader. We're going to call this the scrolling underscore background, so BG, and I'm going to save this in the shaders folder. The mode is going to be canvas item because this is a 2D shader. If it was a 3D shader, we would set it to be spatial. The template can be default, so let's go ahead and create this. You can see that here the shader is created. We can click on it. That's going to open up the shader editor. You can see that as we described, the shader type is canvas item, and we also have the vertex and fragment functions here. And down here we also have a light function. We're going to delete all of that except the vertex shader, because That's what we're going to use to create this effect. Inside of the vertex shader, we have a built-in variable called UV. This is a vector too, so it has an X and Y property. Those are floats. And Godot uses this to map this image, to map this texture onto the sprite. We can multiply the X or the Y to tile the image more. So by default, it's tiled just once, so we get the default texture, and we can multiply it to tile it multiple times on the X or on the Y. So for example, I can say uv.x equals uv.x multiplied by 2. And that's going to tile it 2 times horizontally. I can do the same thing for the Y this time. And that's going to tile it 2 times horizontally. And we can do it for both the X and the Y at the same time. So if I don't specify X or Y here, I simply multiply the whole vector 2 by 2. That's going to tile it twice horizontally and twice vertically so that we get 4 tiles in the same sprite, just like this. So this is working nicely. We don't want to have this hard-coded number here. We're going to turn this into a uniform variable so that we can control it from the inspector. So instead of doing that, let's create a uniform vector 2 called tiling. And by default, we're going to give this 1 by 1. Now that we created a uniform vector 2, you can see that in the shader parameters here on the right, we can change it. The next step is obviously multiplying this with the UV. By default, it doesn't tile it because it's set to be 1 by 1, but now we can change this. For example, I can tile it 10 times on the X like that, 10 times on the Y, just like that. So now we have control from the inspector. Awesome, so this is the tiling effect, so the first step, but obviously currently it's way too small. So let's just drag this to the top left. I'm going to left click hold on the right edge here, bottom right edge. Also, I'm going to hold down the shift key and then I'm going to scale this up to cover the whole window size, just like that. Maybe 10 by 10 is a little bit too large still. I'm going to go with 20 by 20. I think that looks nice. We can try to play the game and see what this looks like in game. I think it's looking good. Don't worry about, the sprite ending here. We're going to fix that shortly. Let's just focus on making it scroll first. So let's open up the shader editor. Again, you can find that in the bottom panel here, or you can also click on the shader again from the material. So now that we have the tiling done, scrolling it is simply going to be giving it an offset. And we can do that by adding a vector 2 to this. So that's also going to be a uniform vector 2 offset. And by default, we'll set this to be 0 by 0. Just like that. And then we're going to add this to UV multiplied by tiling, just like that. Now I can, because it's a uniform, you can see it in the shader params here. Now I'm going to scroll X to scroll it horizontally, just like that. And I can do the same with Y, scroll it vertically, as you can see. Awesome. So we have the functionality working. Now we simply need to, scroll it all the time or animate it. We can do that inside of the shader, or we can do it outside of the shader as well. We can animate this offset using an animation player, for example, but we can also do it within the shader using the time built-in variable. So time is used like this, and this is the global time that Godot is keeping track of since the engine started. It's always going up. So if the engine started 2 minutes ago, this is going to be 120, and each second it's increasing by 1. And it's a floating point number as well, so it also has the decimal components. It's not an integer. What we can do with this is we can multiply this with the offset so that we're constantly scrolling the image. By default right now, it's not going to work because the offset is 0 by 0, so it's essentially just becoming 0 now. But what we can do is we can give, for example, x1 and that's going to scroll it horizontally to the left. We can give it -1, and that's going to scroll to the right. We can do the same with the Y. We can give it 1 to scroll up, we can give it -1 to scroll down, or we can give them both a number to scroll diagonally. I'm going to give these 0.4 by 0.4 so that it scrolls nice and slowly to the top left. I think that's going to look nice. So let's play the game, see what this looks like. You can see that it's scrolling to the top left, and I think this is a nice background effect. I feel like it's a little bit too slow, so I'm just going to put it to 0.6 instead, just like that. Great, so this is the final effect. The last step is going to be fixing the fact that we can walk to the edge of the effect. We can do that by using a canvas layer. So let's create a canvas layer here. Let's put this at the top. We're going to make the background a child of the canvas layer. And then we're going to click on the canvas layer and set the layer to be -10 so that it's behind everything. And now, since the background is on a canvas layer, we're not going to be able to reach the end of it. It's always going to be the same place. So yeah, that is how to create a scrolling background effect in Godot using a vertex shader. Click on this video if you want to continue learning more about shaders in Godot.